Well, good afternoon and welcome to the September webinar from the Bureau of Business Research. My name is Eric Thompson. I'm Director of the Bureau of Business Research and I'll be leading the webinar today. This is actually the first webinar of the academic year for the Bureau, so we'll have them throughout the fall and spring semester. The topic this time is the economic impact of Nebraska's ethanol and co-products industry. Looking at data from some recent years, not the most recent years, but it was a project that had been in the works for a while, and we looked at the years 2018 and 2019. While this is a Bureau of Business Research webinar, I want to definitely point out that the report itself was led by the Department of Agricultural Economics. So Kathleen Brooks from the Department of Agricultural Economics was our lead author on the report. Also from that department, Meyer and Cory Walters worked on the report, and I pitched in as well with the Bureau of Business Research, or is that part of my duties at the Bureau of Business Research, participated in the project, and I'll also be presenting the report today as part of our webinar series. It had also been presented a few months ago by the folks in the Department of Ag Economics. Before I get started with the webinar, I do want to point out a few features. So we have a chat window, so you can chat with some of the other audience members for the webinar. So you can do that either just to say hi or to chat about some of the issues that come up during the webinar. So we're hoping that makes the webinar more interesting and fun. We also have a question and answer window, so we will be answering questions at the end of the webinar, but feel free to type them in as they occur to you, or you can save them to the end of the webinar and type them in at that time. So let me go ahead and get started talking about our report on the economic impact of ethanol in Nebraska, again by Brooks, Meyer, Walters, and Thompson. So in terms of an outline, when we look at the economic impact, we're actually looking at just a specific set of two issues. So how ethanol impacts the Nebraska economy in terms of the sales of ethanol and co-products, in particular the sales that occur outside the state of Nebraska and bring new revenue into the state. We also look at the impact from any increase in corn production that's related to the formation of the ethanol industry in the state. So obviously Nebraska was producing corn long before the ethanol industry started or took off and became large in our state. So we don't want to use every bushel of, we don't want to ascribe every bushel of corn grown to be used in ethanol as an impact of the ethanol industry. But there is some relationship between the formation of the industry and an increase in corn production. And we'll look at that obviously on net, considering the decline in other crops. Now, what is not included in the report? So we don't look at some of the other related economic issues, such as the environmental benefit and cost of ethanol. We don't look at evaluate the ethanol mandate as a public policy. We don't look at ethanol and its impact on consumers or users of the fuel. More looking at how this industry that's concentrated in Nebraska impacts the local economy. Okay, so how did the research team go about gathering data on the ethanol industry and the sales, the value of sales of ethanol and co-products such as distiller's grain and corn oil? Now, this is not a comprehensive list of all the co-products generated by ethanol plants, but it was the major three, particularly at that point in time, and so we focused on those. We did gather data on production of all three, ethanol, distiller's grain by type, and corn oil, from public sources, and also gathered information from a survey of ethanol plants. The price data to combine with the production levels was taken primarily from public sources. Our survey did yield some information on the share of each product, ethanol, distillers grain, corn oil, the share that was sold within the state of Nebraska versus quote unquote exported outside the state to other parts of the country or internationally. Generally speaking, the vast majority of the ethanol itself was sold in other states or overseas. On the other hand, for example, with distillers grain, the significant shares was sold to livestock producers here in the state of Nebraska. So that's how we get the increase or the size of the ethanol industry, the level of business activity in the ethanol industry. We also consider the multiplier impacts based on some software called Implan. So multiplier impacts just look at other jobs in the state that are tied to the formation of the ethanol industry. So obviously ethanol is a manufacturing process that doesn't just utilize corn, it utilizes specialty chemicals, has a water input. There's other standard business inputs like accounting and legal services and so forth. And so the Implan model helps us estimate how many of those purchases are occurring from other businesses in the state of Nebraska. Another part of the multiplier is related to the workers at ethanol facilities. So they're going to spend their paychecks just like we all do at the grocery store, retail stores, housing, healthcare, everything you can think of that people spend their paychecks on, and that also has effect on other businesses. So we'll look at the direct effect as well as that economic multiplier. There's going to be some pretty interesting relationships between the two of them in a very capital and input intensive industry like an ethanol plant. Okay, so here's our estimate of 2019 sales of ethanol and co-products. Just to save time, I don't have an analogous chart for 2018, but it looks fairly similar to this. So I think this tells the story just fine. So if you look at the quantity of ethanol production for that year, we obviously applied the prices we found, and we got just shy of $3 billion of sales of ethanol produced in Nebraska. We also looked at distillers grain, kind of getting a little bit into the weeds in terms of dried, wet, or modified distillers grain. You can see the production estimates there and the resulting sales. So about $0.9 billion in sales of distillers grain, another, I guess, approaching $200 million sales in corn oil, and that led to an overall sales from the ethanol facilities of about $4 billion in 2019. So why do we talk about the co-products as well as the ethanol? Well, part of the reason is about a quarter of the revenue of an ethanol plant, according to these estimates, is from the co-products rather than the ethanol itself. Okay, so I'm just repeating that number of $4.04 billion in the total value or sales of ethanol production during 2019. Now, associated with that, there was also some labor activity. So the ethanol plants had employment just shy of 1,500 workers. And if you look at labor and proprietor income, obviously it's mostly labor income, but there could be some ethanol plants are proprietors rather than corporations. That winds up being about 125 million. So that's the activity that we estimated for the ethanol plants in our state in 2019. Now the activity and the direct economic impact of the ethanol plants are not the same. We were focused on the sales that occurred out of state. And while most ethanol is sold out of state, that's not true of the distillers grain. And so as it turns out, the $4.04 billion in sales, total value of production and sales of the ethanol plant, only led to about $3.2 billion of out-of-state sales. So that's a direct impact on the economy. You see we adjusted the labor and proprietor income and employment proportional without a better way to do it other than a proportional adjustment. You can see we made the proportional adjustment there. So that's the economic impact on the state occurring at the ethanol facilities itself. Then we use those economic multipliers. You can see that column there. So importantly, we were not at this point including any multiplier activity in the corn industry. As I said earlier, Nebraska had a large and vibrant corn production industry long before the ethanol industry formed in our state, and we didn't want to credit all of the ethanol that was corn that was purchased for the ethanol industry as an impact of the ethanol industry. It's more of an impact of the corn industry, obviously. So that one big input is missing, and given that, it's not surprising that the multiplier impact is a little bit smaller compared to the direct sales impact. Another reason for that is some of the specialty chemicals that are used in ethanol production are produced in other states, not in Nebraska. And it could be that lawyers and insurance firms and other service providers to the Nebraska ethanol industry, not all of those are located in Nebraska. So we tried to, again, using the implement model, capture the multiplier impact on our state from businesses providing services to the ethanol plant or where the employees of the ethanol plant spent their paychecks. You can see the labor and proprietor income impacts are actually bigger for the multiplier than the direct impact. And that's really because if you think of the supplier industries or the businesses where people spend their paychecks, those are sort of typical industries in terms of the relationship between sales and labor input. Again, ethanol produces an enormous amount of sales with relatively little labor input because it's a very capital and input intensive industry, much more so than the typical industry. So for that reason, a direct sales impact of $3.2 billion is associated with less than 1,200 jobs in the ethanol industry. In the multiplier industries, more typical industries, a sales impact of about 600 million is associated with about 3,500 jobs. So you add the direct and the multiplier and you end up with the total impact from ethanol production in the state, excluding the use of corn, of about $3.8 billion in 2019, so a little less than the total value of sales, about 300 million in proprietor and labor income, and about 4,600 jobs. Now, we didn't want to totally ignore the influence of ethanol on corn production. So we wanted to include that in the impact to some degree, but in a way we felt made sense or captured the increase in agricultural production in the state, that crop production at least, that might be associated with the development of the ethanol industry here in Nebraska. So we know that ethanol production increases local demand for corn in Nebraska, just as the local livestock production industry increases local demand for corn in Nebraska. This local demand does tend to shift the share of cropland devoted to corn production. In particularly, we had identified some research, recent research in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics that estimated the relationship between ethanol plant location and production and corn production in the surrounding region, production of other crops in the surrounding region. What that research found was the total land devoted to crop production didn't really change in the vicinity of ethanol plants, but there was a shift in what's produced towards corn production and away from grasslands, soybeans, and so forth. So the ethanol plants really, according to that research, led to a change in land use rather than an increase in land use for crop production. Now, corn production is compared to at least the crops commonly grown in Nebraska, is an especially input-intensive crop production in our state. In other words, an acre of corn production will use a lot more inputs, make a lot more purchases from input suppliers than an acre used for grassland, or even in many cases for soybean production. And so we tried to get at that net impact. If the land use changes so that there's more corn production, less production of the other crops, how much additional sales would occur in crops from Nebraska agriculture, and what would be the net economic impact of that, since there would be on net also, or as part of that sales, there would be a net increase in purchases from local businesses. So we estimated that as well. And this is what we came up with for 2019. On net, there would be an increase of about $700 million in sales from agricultural land in the state. If you think about the regions surrounding all the state's 20 or so ethanol plants. Associated that would be about 600 jobs. And you can see the labor and 1,600 jobs. You can see the labor and proprietor income there. And so this is how we captured whether the ethanol plants had any impact on crop production in the state. Remember, that was left out of the multiplier impact that I showed you before. So that because of that, then we combine the two and we get our total overall economic impact, about $4.5 billion, about 6,000 jobs, and associated with those 6,200 jobs, about 40 million of labor and proprietor income. So Nebraska is a state with about 1 million jobs. So, ethanol is one of our industries in the state. But it, like most of the larger industries in the state, it has a meaningful impact on the economy, but doesn't by itself dominate the economy, which is typically what you find when you study some of these key industries in Nebraska or any state. I think the one notable thing is it is an industry that creates a lot of employment in the micropolitan, the small city areas of Nebraska. That's where a lot of these ethanol plants are located. Some of the suppliers are located there. That's often a policy goal, for better or worse, that's stated by leadership in Nebraska to even out the economic growth of the state among its regions. And so ethanol arguably contributes to that as well. Although if you look at it, there is a surprising impact on the metropolitan areas of the state, as well as some of the key suppliers to the ethanol industry are located in Omaha, Lincoln, and so forth. So that's really, I guess, the key points I wanted to present today. So I'll open it up for questions that have come along, or you have time to type in a question now as well. Okay, I'm trying to see if we've gotten any yet. Okay. Well, I'll give you a minute. Again, I want to thank our lead author, Kathleen Brooks, Tim Meyer and Cory Walters from the Department of Agricultural Economics, who played a key role in the report, and then I pitched in as well. Okay, so it's always interesting to see if I can read the question. Eyes don't work as well as they used to. Okay, is the ethanol industry trending in an upward direction with EVs becoming a factor? So in recent years, the ethanol industry has had, I guess I would say, modest growth or relatively little growth. So there was a large expansion of the industry. It kind of grew to a more mature level in the state, and it's been fairly steady since then. Obviously, the value of output fluctuates from year to year with ethanol prices and prices for distillers grain and related products. The amount of employment labor income rises with inflation and so forth, but the amount of employment is fairly steady. Now, the industry is expanding in the sense that it's growing its co-products, so that does contribute to sales somewhat. And then obviously, as plants get modernized and so forth, they get more productive, as would occur in any industry. Now, an excellent point about the EVs. So with the growth of the EV sector within the United States, and that's starting to pick up pace here for sure, that's going to decrease demand for fuel, and that will include ethanol as a fuel. So that is an excellent point, and something that may will affect trends at some point, depending on, I suppose, if sort of alternative uses of ethanol and its co-products in other industries besides transportation grows, it could mitigate some of those trends. But obviously, the growth of EVs will have an effect on a lot of industries, including ethanol. Second question, what is the environmental impact of ethanol production? So that's obviously a topic of great discussion. When ethanol was first introduced, it was introduced as having environmental benefits, but of course it's also true that petroleum is used as an input in agricultural production, in ethanol plants themselves in some cases. And people have looked at the net environmental impact of ethanol production and have found a variety of results depending on their approach and methodology. I think it's fair to say that considering those factors causes one to reduce any environmental benefits from ethanol production, and some studies have even found very little benefit and costs for some things. Okay, next question. Is there value in locating ethanol plants in rural areas that desperately need economic growth, or do inputs and need for labor outweigh this initiative? Yes. Well, the ethanol industry obviously benefits to a degree, or exists to a degree, due to government policy with ethanol mandates. That said, the location of ethanol plants is more of an economic decision. Obviously, it's critical to be in a region with substantial corn production capacity, and then the facilities choose locations. Obviously, rail access is important. That doesn't necessarily rule out rural economic areas or rural areas, but the need for labor inputs. There's a substantial need for infrastructure and utilities, and this is what I think tends to cause ethanol facilities to choose, or to have to choose, these micropolitan communities. Again, cities of 10,000, cities of 25,000, cities of 45,000 people. So that would be challenging. Now, that said, I mean, you got to remember Nebraskans are willing to commute. And so often, say a city like Columbus or a city like North Platte is an employment center for a surrounding region that can go out 50, 60, 75 miles. And therefore, even if the plant is located in the micropolitan area, it might be providing employment opportunities and living opportunities for a much wider region. Okay, well, you still have a moment to ask more questions as we tell you about our next Bureau of Business webinar upcoming in October 28th. In this webinar, we're going to let our Bureau scholars who are involved in producing research posters. We couldn't, at the end of last year, we weren't able to allow some of our scholars to share their research posters, so that's going to be our next webinar where we will be presenting or allowing 2 or 3 of our students or groups of students present their research projects from last year on a variety of economic topics. In one case, kind of a economic / political science type topic. So looking forward to that. It's always one of our most enjoyable webinars every year. Of course, you can keep in touch with what's going on at the Bureau of Business Research via various types of social media, or just email us at bbr@unl.edu, especially if you'd like to join our mailing list or email list. You do need to email us at that address. Was there an additional question? I don't believe so. So we're going to go ahead and thank everyone for attending the webinar today, for your excellent questions. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you in October.